coming after lunch. Before we start, I'm really curious, a show of hands here. How many people are here from Europe? Most. Okay, good. Good to know. So what we're going to talk about today is growing ASEAN economies, but also very much with a focus for Europeans and what's ASEAN about and why you may want to come. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Unfortunately, it's not the presentation that Stuart missed last year. That was something else, I know. But this should be pretty good, so let's get going. So a little bit about what we're going to do today. The agenda, I'm not going to tell you what's on the agenda. You can figure that out. A little bit about me. So I've been in Asia for 30 years now. I'm an American, you can probably tell. I've launched companies in 12 countries. I've either started or co-founded 6 companies, startups. I've had 3 exits. 2 of them were trade sales. One was Internet 1.0 rocket ship NASDAQ listing. And we went public on the second worst day in the history of NASDAQ. So we were all wealthy for about 4 minutes, but it was pretty exciting. I started MTVAsia.com, and I kind of ran all of MTV's internet and nascent mobile products for a while. I ran Telstra's Southeast Asia Accelerator. Telstra is, of course, the Australian telco. And I worked with Asian Development Bank recently to help them set up their first venture fund called ADB Ventures, which was an impact fund for emerging markets across Asia. In addition, I've worked with pretty much all of the accelerator programs in this part of the world, some regional, some global, so SOSV, 500, Techstars, SeedStars, the usual suspects. And now I run a company called Asia Founder Coaching, and I work with post-seed stage founders and their executive teams. So if that includes you, you don't have to be in Asia, but if that includes you and you're looking for a little help, better call Paul. Just remember that. That's all you need to remember. So a little bit about the EU and ASEAN. If you're from Europe, you know that the past 5 years haven't been great. There was COVID, there was the war in Ukraine, then of course gas prices went up, and then of course food prices went up, and then inflation went up, and so this hasn't been the happiest time if you're running a business, or even just not running a business if you're just a normal human consumer. It's been very difficult and unsure of what's going on, right? And that's reflected, of course, in the GDP growth rates across Europe, in the Eurozone. It's pretty low right now, and it's going to continue. All projections are it's going to continue to be pretty low for the next 4 or 5 years, okay? Inflation rates are coming down, but as you know, if you live in Europe, things went very expensive very quickly and have stayed. The prices have stayed high, but the inflation isn't necessarily growing as quickly as it was. But, you know, the past couple of years haven't been so good on your wallet and pocketbook. And so the European Commission says it's not so rosy, really. Lower GDP growth, high cost of living, so inflation and food and energy costs are still driving those high costs. Retail sales are down or flat. There's labor shortages. But there are a couple of bright spots. It's not all doom and gloom. Business and IT services, which many of you probably still work in, are expanding and are projected to continue to expand for the next 5-6 years. And low unemployment. Because of the labor shortage, then you have low unemployment. So one reflects with the other one, kind of hand in glove. So a little bit about ASEAN now, too. We'll get into the details in a second, but this is just kind of as a quick comparison to get us started. ASEAN has robust economic growth. There's a huge domestic demand. Tourism has come back. Domestic investment continues to grow. The governments are putting a lot of money into expanding and improving things in each country, plus consumers are buying and companies are expanding and CapEx is growing. But there are inflation concerns and, of course, with food prices and energy prices. And the big question mark, well, one of the two big question marks for this part of the world is China. Nobody really knows what's going to happen with China. If their economy continues to go south and contract, nobody really knows what's going to happen to countries around here. You know, when there's an old cliche, which I'll borrow, that says when China sneezes, everybody catches a cold. And I think that that's what it's going to be like here, but nobody knows whether China's sneezing or not. So we'll see, but it's a big unknown. Asian GDP rates are much, much, much higher. Okay, GDP isn't the only measure, of course, of the health of an economy, but it's a good thumbnail to take a look at what's going on. And just so you know, this is what it looks like compared to the EU. So the ASEAN region is growing a lot faster, right? So let's get into then the landscapes here and the drivers. But first, I'm not sure everybody knows what ASEAN is, so let's have a little review. It's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and it was established in 1967, partly driven by the conflict in Vietnam at that point, and driven kind of behind the scenes by the US, but it's turned into its own economic powerhouse now. Okay, it has 10 countries currently, and 690 million people. So a lot of people in these 10 countries, right? So 8.5% of the world's population is here. And it covers a lot of area. I don't know how many of you have traveled beyond Thailand, but a lot of the local economies and a lot of the neighbors here are part of ASEAN. Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore, Brunei, Malaysia, and then Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar as well. So those are the ASEAN nations. And many of you are from Europe, but let's just touch for a quick comparison. EU is European Union, also originally established in 1967. 27 member states with 9 kind of circling to see if they'll get admitted eventually, which they probably will, but it'll take a while. And 448 million people, so it's about 2/3 of the population of ASEAN. So it's a third smaller, right? And a little less of the global population, but about the same size of landmass as ASEAN. So those are the two areas and groups that we're comparing today. Let's go back to the EU for a second and talk about what the constraints are here. The EU economies suffer from kind of a hangover of past recessions. So in 2007, 2008, when there was the global financial crisis, a lot of countries within the EU took a long time to recover. A lot of economies did, especially in Southern Europe. Some of them took 15, 20 years to really start to see positive growth again. It took a long time for economies to get better. Equally, COVID is still reverberating. Weak domestic demand and consumer prices were driven up, and they are still increasing, though not as quickly as they used to be. And then there are regulatory challenges as well. As inflation continues to rise, governments, their hands are tied in kind of what they can and can't do to help goose the economies. So there's a lot of sovereign debt, and inflation is going on, so there's not a lot of what the EU can do. Some wild cards in the economic growth for the EU. The war in Ukraine, of course, impacts food and energy costs, and it did very much so when it started, and I think you all saw last year as your fuel and food costs went skyrocketing. There are also refugee issues in neighboring countries are impacted with people coming in, trying to escape the impact of the conflict there. There's also some domestic political instability in individual countries, right? There's a move towards populism in certain countries, and there's street protests, and students and different people, of course, are protesting against different things. So it's not entirely stable, and it's not entirely smooth sailing for any of the political leaders, either locally or within the EU. And then, of course, the expansion of the war in the Middle East is another kind of wild card here. No one really knows how long, how far, how big, what the implications are. So, but one thing we do know is that energy costs are going to go up, and there's going to be some domestic divisiveness depending on who's supporting which sides here. So that's not a happy situation either, and it's a big unknown. Nobody really knows where it's going to go. So, but there are positives here. Employment rates, unemployment is about 6.5%, which for some countries is kind of high, but for the EU is pretty standard and pretty good. You know, it seems like the European Commission likes this number because what's happening is it is bordering on what they consider full employment. And so then there's increased wages, and then domestic demand goes up, and the domestic economies all grow, which is great. Energy source diversification, which for a lot of reasons is a good thing, but it was driven primarily by the war in Ukraine because a lot of the energy, the oil and the natural gas were coming from Russia and neighboring countries. So this has accelerated the shift to renewables, and the European Union has been putting a lot of money into that, which is good all around. But it doesn't happen overnight, and that's going to be a couple of years till we really see lower costs or more environmentally friendly kinds of energy. But it is heading in that direction, which is, you know, great for everybody. So that's a good thing. And then the EU itself has put 95 billion euros into investing in R&D for high technology. So this aims to spur economic growth and provides a lot new economic opportunities. And I think we're starting to see a little bit of the effect of that, but in the next 18 to 24 months, we'll start to see new technologies come online, and some of those are in conjunction with energy production. Some of those are just different kinds of things, you know, as networks and old power infrastructure gets improved. So everybody benefits from those as well. So let's hop over to ASEAN now, a little comparison. Since COVID, there's been an increased domestic demand, which is nice because it was pretty dire in most countries here. I think if anybody here has lived in Southeast Asia through COVID, you know, it was pretty much shut down here in Thailand. I lived in Singapore, and it was pretty shut down. Philippines was worse. You know, in some of the other countries, nobody was coming in or out of the countries. There was no trade. There was very little domestic demand. It was pretty dire. So we're seeing a real pent-up increase in tourism to Southeast Asia in general. Some from China, some from India, some from Europe, some from North America, but it's really increased again, which is important to these young economies, still rely a lot on tourism. And then, of course, household income and consumer spending are up as people go back to work, and they can travel, and they can buy new things, and they know that they have a job and they have a salary coming in, which is good. One of the major exports from some of the more developed countries here in Southeast Asia are technology and electronics related, and those continue to grow, which is a good thing, and there's a lot of new product development happening as well. So we're starting to see those kinds of products and those economies here, Malaysia, to some extent Singapore, and Vietnam and Indonesia are starting to really get the benefits of that. And employment continues to grow. So post-COVID employment numbers are up, and cross-border migration fills key shortages. So an example of a key shortage would be if you live in Singapore, there aren't enough nurses. There aren't enough people to work at restaurants. There aren't enough people to do semi-skilled jobs. And so what happens is we have migration from neighboring countries, from the Philippines or Indonesia or Vietnam, or increasingly from Myanmar or Laos to come in and fill the gaps. So that's happening, and there's different countries within ASEAN helping up other countries who have shortages in specific areas of employment. So the wild cards here are, most importantly, El Nino. And most people don't think of El Nino as being such a big thing, but here, because if the weather patterns change significantly, so does the production of food. And domestic food production, of course, is very important. And so if it doesn't rain, or it gets too hot, or it does rain too much, all of those things really impact people and local economies very strongly. China's economy, again, nobody really knows what's going to happen, so it could affect consumption and exports of goods from here, but also then tourism, Chinese tourists coming to this part of the world and spending money on buying things here. And then global conflicts, just like in Europe, this could drive up higher energy costs and could stir inflation, but nobody really knows just when and how and if that's going to happen. But if you were a real economist, not me, if you were a real economist, you'd be worrying about these kinds of things, right? So there's some actual threats to the economic growth. Unemployment and aging population. Even though the unemployment rates are lower than what they are in the EU, these are high relative for this part of the world, okay? And there's an increasingly large percentage of elderly people for the first time really in any of the economies in Southeast Asia, and this happens, kind of everywhere in the world as you industrialize and the economy gets a little wealthier, people stop having babies, and then the aging population increases, and we're starting to see that in many places. And that's changing how the economy works when you have 25% of your population all of a sudden isn't working, it isn't contributing to the economy, it makes a big difference. Then also, unlike the EU, there are unilateral political agendas. So every country, of course, is a sovereign nation, and they have their own politics, and they have their own goals, and they have their own strategies, and they don't always play well together, even though they're part of ASEAN, and they get together once or twice a year and smile and all shake hands and all. There's a lot of different agendas going on at a lot of different levels, whether it's political, whether it's military, whether it's trade. It's not a unified group. When I used to work for MTV, I'd give talks to Westerners about Asia not being monolithic, and people would always kid me that I had to have the monolithic line in every presentation that I give. And I'll give it here too, because ASEAN's not monolithic either, and every country has its own agenda, and they look after themselves and their people. And sometimes, they bump heads or shoulders, or there are skirmishes. So it's not quite as unified as Europe is in moving forwards. And then there's uneven domestic growth and poverty. So a lot of countries still have a very large urban-rural split to them. Not so much Singapore, but kind of everywhere else. And often that then also reflects in poverty levels, that the rural population is often poorer, has less access to healthcare, has less access to education, while the city dwellers generally have all of those kinds of things. So there's a split there and some tensions there internally and domestically as well. So let's do a little deeper dive here. Here's my monolithic slide. I jumped the gun. Okay, so there's varying degrees of development within ASEAN. There's varying degrees of education and workforce skills, both across ASEAN and then within most of the countries as well. Vastly different laws, different political agendas, but opportunities exist in each of the countries. So just so you get a quick picture, if you don't know so much about ASEAN, Singapore is probably the most highly developed country. High GDP, high levels of education, investment, technology. If you visited, you see what it looks like, and you can see it happening, right? I mean, it's very, very advanced. Thailand and Malaysia are like kind of the next tier, and they have growing infrastructure and strong domestic consumption, increasing foreign direct investment, FDI, coming in, and technology is starting to infiltrate at different levels of government and how people live, and you're starting to see that more and more. QR codes in the past 2 years, post-COVID, have become ubiquitous, and e-payments and mobile payments have become very popular as well. The next tier would be then Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, which actually is a lot of people. That's probably 60% of the population, 2/3 of the population of ASEAN are those three countries. And there's growing infrastructure and domestic consumption, but there's a really large urban and rural split. And that split is economic, it's education, it's healthcare, it's family size, it's consumption, all of those different kinds of things. And of course, then it used to be called CMLV, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam, but I think most people are seeing Vietnam has stepped up into the emerging level, and it's still pretty early in these three countries, mostly rural, very uneven levels of education and healthcare. Government spending and support is really scattered. So ASEAN is not monolithic. It has a lot of different kinds of people, a lot of farmers, a lot of city dwellers, a lot of poor people, a lot of rich people. You can kind of see it here as well, just in Bangkok, right? You can see that wide range. But because of that, and this is, I think, the most interesting bit for me, is that means there's a lot of opportunity in ASEAN. So one of the subtexts of this talk is if you are running a company in the EU and you have flat growth, or you don't know where your next investment dollars are going to come from, or your next partnerships, or if you're manufacturing actual product, hard product rather than software, where you're going to be doing that, where the costs are going to be higher or lower. There's a really big opportunity in this part of the world, in ASEAN, for you. And that's really what the last part of this talk is about, is looking at some of those opportunities. I don't know what, I know what some of you do, but I don't know what all of you do. But if you're looking for new markets and you're looking for partnerships and you're looking to expand, this is a really great place. So let's just run through a couple of those topics on a per country basis. Well, no, we'll look at it on a subject basis. So food, education, healthcare, urbanization. Well, you can read this, okay? But to me, these are all starting to happen now, and there's a very conscious focus on green development, renewable resources, renewable products, and ESG standing and the SDGs. A lot of companies are doing, it's not greenwashing anymore. A lot of companies are focusing very much on these aspects of their business and how they can transform now, post-COVID, post-inflation bump, into something that's more renewable, that's greener, that's better for the environment, and therefore better for their bottom line too. It's not an either or. This is really the direction most companies are heading in, which is also a good thing, right? So let's just walk through some of them. In food production is pretty big here. A lot of farms. The number of actual number of farms and farmers in Southeast Asia, but I do know that about 80 to 85% of them are still family farms, very different from Europe and North America, right? So people are still struggling to get that other water buffalo. They're struggling to get. It's not me, it's the mic. So a lot of people are struggling just to make ends meet, get that new crop in, get the new seeds in. So people live very close to the edge here. So there's a lot of different ways to improve production for aquaculture and agriculture. There's a lot of aquaculture here, a lot of prawn farms, a lot of fish farms. There's a lot of wastage that can be dealt with. There's organic production methodology that doesn't blow out the land after 2 or 3 or 5 crops, right? Pest control, same thing. There's an enormous amount of wastage going from farms to distribution centers. Some people say up to 30% of what is grown on a farm in Southeast Asia never even makes it to a market, okay? So just think of, with a lot of hungry people, making that more efficient, that's a real business. That's a really important business too, okay? And then local production to consumption, farm to table is what we call it in the West, but I think there's a swing back towards trying to be eat local, produce local, consume local as well. So opportunities there. In education, there's such a gap between urban and rural education levels, and a lot of the countries don't have money to educate everybody. So now with remote learning, there's a lot of opportunity there to make sure that all people have access to similar education at education levels and have a synchronized curriculum. So sometimes in a country, people learn different things in the north or the south or the east or the west, or in some cities versus other cities. So being able to synchronize a national curriculum is really important. There's degrees, there's the opportunity to get higher degrees with remote learning without having to actually move to the big city. And which is very hard for a lot of people, especially if you're not particularly wealthy. Moving to the capital city in order to go an advanced degree is very difficult for families to support, and maybe make it impossible for you to do so. There's multiple languages here, so I was amazed. I was researching this today. There's 700 distinct languages in Indonesia, right? And that doesn't even count Papua New Guinea, which is next to Indonesia, which has 3,000, I think is the number, right? I mean, it has more languages than any other country on the planet. But there's 150 local languages in the Philippines. If people can learn other languages, if they can learn a similar language and local languages, there's a lot of benefit to doing that. And these are countries. Indonesia has 300 million people, right? And Philippines has 100 million people. You can change a lot of things if you can get people literally speaking the same language, right? Technical training and certification, again, with distance learning, so lots of opportunity there. Healthcare, if anybody saw Kun Bob the other day talking about investing in online pharmacies, definitely the wave of the future, rather than driving 30 miles or 50 kilometers to go get some medicine, which you may or may not do because it's too much of a pain. Now it can be delivered, right? You can order online. It can be prescribed online. You can see doctors online. That also feeds into prevention, so people can learn how to clean their water, how to clean their plates, how to, clean wounds, those kinds of things, right? Nutrition, food safety, mental health care. Mental health is a huge issue. I've worked with a local company here in Thailand for a number of years. Offers mental health care to teens and young adults, and it's incredibly popular, which is great that people are doing it, but the demand is definitely there, and it hasn't been there. There hasn't been a solution to that problem previously, but now it is, right? So lots of opportunity in that space. And then again, training and certification for healthcare professionals. So just a few more, don't worry. Housing, traffic issues, public transport, sanitation, clean water, civil service, all of this can be improved radically, right? I mean, we all see the traffic issues here. We all see the traffic issues in every major metropolitan city across Southeast Asia, well, across all of Asia, but specifically in ASEAN, your Bangkoks, your Jakartas, your Manilas all have a lot of traffic issues. Those can get help. The housing can be planned more cohesively. Public transport, sanitation, civil services, all can benefit from technology and applications of new and improved software and hardware advances. And of course, energy. And the drive for clean energy and new sources of energy that are not carbon-based have just been exacerbated, obviously, in the past 2 or 3 years. We see that with the war in Ukraine. We see that with the troubles in the Middle East. We'll see that you see that in Africa and Nigeria. It's only going to be more problematic. So if there are alternative ways to generate electricity and power locally and cleanly, a lot of change can come there. So whether they're smart meters or whether they're turbines or whether it's tidal water generators, lots of opportunity. Cogeneration, batteries, storage, smart metering. I've lived in a lot of places in Southeast Asia with some meters that are definitely older than me, and I'm sure they can't be that accurate, right? And you multiply that times 5 million people in a large city, or 11 million people in a large city like this, and it's just inefficient, and there's leakage, and money's falling out of the cracks. So I think we'll see a lot of change opportunity there. Transportation, you've all seen it here. The trains, if you've been to Bangkok 20 years ago and you're in Bangkok now, you know the difference of what a train system can do, what mass transit can do. It's been really radical change here. Interurban transit, clean water, vessels, tolls, paid usage, traffic flow, airports. Thailand has some pretty good airports. I can't say that for other ASEAN nations. Manila, I'm talking to you. Manila has, probably one of the worst airports in Asia, and it's never gotten better. It's been 30 years and it just hasn't gotten better, but it can, right? The technology exists and the planning exists, and one day it will. And then, of course, there's commerce and banking. Again, a lot of this was pushed forwards by COVID, but we found, I don't know about in Europe, but here QR codes went from not being used hardly at all to being ubiquitous. It's virtually cashless here. You can do, if you're a local, you can do virtually everything without cash, from buying food to buying your Grab or your taxi to getting on the train, to getting your noodles at 2 in the morning. Everybody has a QR code, right? And the banks have been really good at implementing these systems. Again, an example here is that people order food all the time, right? I mean, at 3 in the morning, if you want some noodles, you can order via Grab, and there's somebody someplace making noodles, and it'll be delivered to your house for 8 or 12 baht, right? Extra, so it's great. You're starting to see food hubs and food distribution hubs, ghost kitchens, microloans and credit facilities that were impossible 2 years ago are now becoming more possible as people's spending and consumption records are being kept because they're doing banking and purchasing online. Now banks and other lenders can look and see whether you're able to pay back loans, so you can do microloans even if you don't have a bank account, right? And eventually moving towards a cashless society. So if you're involved in any of these things, you know, there's a huge amount of opportunity here. The gap between rich and poor, urban, rural, the size of the GDP, the amount of money that people are making, there's just a lot of change can happen and will happen in the next 20 to 25 years here. I mean, I hope I can hang around for 25 years and see the change, because what I have seen in 30 years has been remarkable, but I think, you know, it's going to get a whole lot better, a whole lot sooner. So let's sum this up. Why an ASEAN alternative for you Europeans? I'm talking to you Euros out there, okay? New markets and customers, growing economies and populations, structural gaps create new opportunities and big opportunities, an increasingly educated workforce at a lower salary level than what you're paying in Western Europe, active government encouragement. The governments are really seeing technology and change as being drivers for the local economies. And then the other side of the coin is diversified income streams for your company. Like if you're only doing business in Western Europe and you have another COVID, or the war gets bigger in Ukraine, you know, what are you going to do? You're kind of getting hammered. So having a diversified set of income streams is really important for a strategy. Equally for production and manufacturing, if you're making hard goods, having other maybe cheaper, maybe different kinds of manufacturing options. And also additional funding and investment sources. I have not touched on banks and investments and VCs and private equity here. There's a lot of cash. There is a lot of cash floating around here. So if you're looking to do something new or to partner, there's an entirely new set of people you can be talking to who have money and are looking for great, smart founders and companies and operations. So real briefly, how do you begin? How do you start to do this? Every government in Southeast Asia has a very aggressive, active program to make it easy and expand and invest there. Singapore led this with their Economic Development Board, which is, if you follow Singapore's economy at all, you'll see that they've gone through varying stages of increasingly high technology that they're attracting companies in and giving them tax breaks or co-investment or support. And now other countries are doing that as well. Indonesia's been great. Thailand's doing it. Philippines doing it. Vietnam's starting to do it. Then there are expert third parties like Globalization Partners and others like them who will help take you and help you expand at a pretty low touch into new markets, provide you with facilities and people and HR without you having to set up your own entity and making lots of mistakes and spending lots of money and bumping your head on every wall. You don't have to hit every wall, right? And the large consulting firms, the obvious guys, can help you do that as well. And then, you know, a lot of the global banks are starting to do this. And so
and even your customers. This is your customers. So maybe you have customers here who can help you come into Thailand, who can help you come to Indonesia or the Philippines, right? Start talking to them. If this is interesting to you, talk to everybody. Okay, so that's kind of it. This is kind of a rude slide. I'm going to end on a rude slide. So, EU, ASEAN. What do you think? All right, so questions?
Thank you, Paul.
Sure.
So that was a huge presentation with lots of information I think is super relevant, and I hope it's tantalized some people in Europe to look at this part of the world. Who's got the first question? Yes. Let me run up there.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. Now, as a European, one of the things that I've very much enjoyed over the last 20 years in Europe is the monetary union, but also the free flow of people and goods throughout the EU, which has really helped the whole economy. Is this something that you think ASEAN is also striving to, having one currency, opening the borders to people and goods, services and such? I believe that could be one of the thriving forces for ASEAN to grow further.
Good question. I think the latter will happen and is happening more, that ASEAN members can travel amongst ASEAN countries pretty much visa-free, okay, already. So it's pretty easy. I don't see a single currency happening for a long time here. I mean, I'm not an expert in it, but I just don't see it happening.
However, as Paul pointed out with these QR codes, if you from Thailand travel to Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, I can use my Thai banking app, scan at a 7-Eleven in Indonesia, and it's got instant transaction with a super good exchange rate.
Yeah.
So it's almost like we're running the same currency. So, and they can do it reciprocated here. So you can go even to a vendor on the side of the road and buy some noodles.
Yeah.
If you're from Indonesia walking in Thailand, scan your bank app just like you would in downtown Jakarta, and it's just like you were using the same currency.
Actually, that's a really good point too, is that it's probably easier for consumers than it is for businesses, right? It gets a lot gnarlier if you're transferring, you know, $10 million, $100 million. But you want noodles on the street, it's pretty easy. Yeah. Is that the same in Europe? Do you find that across Europe as well?
Yeah, I was in Germany a few months ago, and I found that I used more cash in the short time I was in Germany than I did in a year in Thailand.
I used to take $200 out in Singapore once a week, twice a week. And now if I go there, $200 stays in my pocket. It doesn't come out of my wallet, right? It just stays there. It goes to my kids.
Next question. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul, first of all. Super interesting. For me, business is also something that has to do with relating to people. So what do you think, and ASEAN seems to be very diverse in a sense. Maybe what will be a good starting point for a European company? Or where are maybe also in between these different countries massive differences, cultural differences in making business?
Well, this isn't an ad, but I do teach a course on exactly that. But I think it's driven more by your business, right? will if you're going to sell, is that market ready for your product? Are people buying similar products or your product already, right? Or the other side where you're manufacturing or creating things, is there the capability for doing that? And I think with a little research, some online research and some feet on the ground research, which I think is still the best kind to do, you could find out which markets are the most likely, and then you get to the next level where you start looking at companies, looking at banks, looking at governments, looking at rules, and talking to people and trying to find out how to do it. The personal bit is very important, and some countries are people are easier to work with than others, some because our Western brains can figure it out, some because they can figure us out better, right? But I think ultimately the reason for expanding to any country is to sell and knowing that your product will be sold there or that you can manufacture or partner there. That should be always your first question. Did that help?
Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question in regards to sustainability. So I'm from Norway and I arrived here last year. And I think 95% of the lunches that I had with my colleagues back in Norway was around sustainability because it's such a huge thing. And when I came here and started working here, I still can count on one hand how many lunches where sustainability has been a topic. Where do you see that like sustainability comes top of mind for customers and businesses? Do you think it's going to happen and when, potentially?
I think it's happening at the top levels, and I think it's happening at the boardroom level, right? Investors and banks and shareholders are pushing hard. I'm not sure that people within the companies who work there are as concerned about it as you might be in the West, as we might be in the West. And certainly, you know, if you buy anything on the street here, if you live in Bangkok, you know, I'm stunned by how much plastic waste I generate as one human every day in Thailand, right? So it hasn't gotten down to that level yet. But there's more discussion there, there's more legislation there. The banks are talking about it, the shareholders are talking about it. It's not going to be as fast as the West, but it'll come. It has to, right? I mean, it simply has to.
Just overnight in Thailand, we went from you would get a plastic bag for everything you bought in 7-Eleven, and now like literally you would walk out of one trip and you'd have 10 plastic bags. And overnight, I think a couple of years ago, they said you have to pay for them. And so now many people take bags with them, or they pay 1 baht and you'll go out with one. So things change, and I never thought I'd see that change. So it's happening.
Yeah, or in Makati, you know, in Manila, you know, it's all paper bags. And I'm like, of all the places I go to, Manila was like the last place I thought I'd see that. But, you know, they're able to pull it off, so it's kind of cool. That's not to say we're getting close. Those are the first steps, right? So it needs to keep happening.
Hi, Peter. You talked about ASEAN, but you haven't mentioned the influence that the big other countries have on the development of Asia, China, Japan, Australia, the big boys in the region. So how free are they to actually control their own future? And how does that affect anyone moving into the region as well?
I think that's a good question. I think the biggest influence, the Jupiter in this galaxy, is definitely China, right? And every country in Southeast Asia and most countries around the world buy a lot of things from China, right? So if the economy's not doing well there, or people are unemployed, or they have riots, or you know, any sort of meltdown or anything, it will affect everyone. As China's economy dipped, you saw less tourists here, right, in Thailand specifically. So then the economy took a hit. I think while Japan and Korea and Australia are large trading partners, it's China, China, China is really the story right now. And everybody's looking north to see what's going on.
Hello. Over here, Paul.
Oh, hi.
Maybe I can add a little context. I'm Thai American. One of the gentlemen talked about the manufacturing, I think, here. Earlier this year, I met a Russian business owner. He's making cosmetic like Mistine, but he moved to Southeast Asia. And I introduced him to Cosmoprof. So now he's figured out how to do the same thing but duplicate out here. But his initial drive was to not have his son go into Putin's army, just FYI. And the sustainability thing in Thailand in the last, I think, 2.5 years, in the set, there's a thing called THSI, the Thailand Sustainability Index, and there's roughly, I would say, like what you said, a lot of the top, AIS and Sensory, the really big top 100 companies in Thailand, they have committed to the SDG goals of zero, carbon footprint or whatever it is that they named as part of their ESG metrics. So if that's of interest, I suggest to look into THSI, which is a subset within the set. And with the, with the higher ranking on there, they get, good benefits. There's economic benefits on that, like green financing and other things that comes with it. And of course, the green sustainability tag, if you will. My question to you is, what do you foresee in 2024 as being like the top growth, industry?
Across all of ASEAN?
ASEAN or Thailand or whatever you can name.
The non-monolithic ASEAN. It's hard to predict across a region as diverse as ASEAN, I think. I think in Thailand, that's a really good question. There's a new prime minister here, and he has some new rules coming in, maybe. And we'll have to see what happens there. Some of it has to do with flow of cash and overseas cash and what happens there. But I think that the economy will continue to do a little bit better. Tourism, they're going to try to goose tourism with China and India here. I think that's going to be big if that happens, and will change a lot of things. And I guess those are my little predictions for Thailand, having lived here all of 9 months as an expert now.
Okay, maybe just one or two last questions. Here's one for you, Paul. If you're a Western European company coming to set up shop here in Thailand or work in Thailand or Southeast Asia, what are some of the gotchas?
The one that got me to start with was things look like they are where you come from, but they're not. And especially in Singapore and in some of the major cities, I mean like Bangkok or Jakarta or Manila, it looks just like home, there's fast food, there's Dunkin' Donuts, there's all the items are on the shelves. So you kind of get lulled into a sense of security that things under the hood work very similarly, but they don't. They don't at all. That's part one. Part two is each individual country and multiple places within a single country have very distinct cultural attributes and behaviors that it takes a while to learn. And a lot of that means shutting up. And that was a very hard lesson for me, was just to ask questions and let people teach you, because, especially if you're running a company and maybe a white male running a company, you come with your own predispositions, and it's hard to shut up and listen and learn. I think that's really important to do as well. But spend time on the ground. It amazes me how many companies I'll talk to or consult with that they'll send people here for a week or two and say, okay, now we're experts and we're going to go in, and you're not. You're nowhere close. So especially for senior management and operational management, spending time on the ground before you spend a lot of money is really essential. And just learn, shut up and learn.
Here. Okay. Any one last question, comment before we wrap up? Okay. Well, with that, please put your hands together for Mr. Paul Meyers. Don't get off the stage yet.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
อันไหนนะ
ครับ
And just a small token.
Can I drink it?
It's Bangkok. But thank you very much, Paul.
Sure.
That was phenomenal, and I hope and trust that it's been good information for everybody, and hopefully inspired some of you to come and invest more in this part of the world.
And remember, better call Paul, right?
Better call
Okay.
Paul. Okay, thanks, Paul.
Thank you so much.
ครับ
Thanks,
สวัสดีครับ
ครับ
Next session starts in 20 minutes. Oh, sorry, no. 4:30. Okay, so less than that. A bit of flexibility.